The notification chime on my smartphone didn't just interrupt my morning coffee, it punctured the curated silence of my kitchen like a needle through a balloon. I am a surgeon by trade, and I have spent my career cultivating a specific brand of calm. My hands do not shake, my heart rate does not spike, and my expressions are generally as unreadable as a blank chart. But as I sat there, the steam from my mug curling into the air, the text on the screen began to blur the edges of my professional composure. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The email was from Desmond, my younger brother, though younger had always been a relative term for more entitled. The subject line was deceptively festive. Holiday logistics. I tapped it open, expecting the usual debates over who would bring the expensive wine or which caterer Gretchen had deemed acceptable for this year's social circle. Instead, I found a digital manifesto of exclusion. Desmond and Gretchen had decided that this year, the annual family gathering at the Mountain Estate, a property I largely funded through my excessive overtime, would be an adults-only affair, or rather, a core family affair. He went on to explain, with a clinical coldness that would have made a tombstone jealous, that my children were not invited. He cited spatial constraints and a desire for a sophisticated atmosphere. He even had the audacity to suggest that my kids would be happier at a local daycare camp while we celebrated. I looked up from the screen. Through the window, I could see Leo and Maya in the backyard, oblivious, trying to build a fort out of fallen branches and old blankets. They were 8 and 10, old enough to understand when they were being discarded and far too young to deserve it. The internal commentary in my head, usually a quiet hum of anatomical observations, suddenly shifted into a sharp, sarcastic roar. Sophisticated atmosphere? Desmond's idea of sophistication was a gold-plated coaster and a watch he couldn't afford without my monthly loans. Gretchen's idea of a core family was anyone who validated her status as a local socialite. I felt a surge of something cold and calculating settling behind my ribs. It wasn't the heat of a tantrum, it was the icy precision of a pre-operative plan. I scrolled further down, finding an attachment. It was a gallery of photos from Desmond's newly finished game room in the basement of his home. There it was, the high-end pool table, the custom cabinetry, the tiered seating for a home theater, all of it gleaming. I remembered the $3,000 check I'd written him last June for his urgent home repairs. Apparently, a leaky roof looked remarkably like a vintage arcade cabinet when viewed through the lens of a Wolf Brothers conscience. He hadn't just used me. He was gloating. He was inviting me to watch him spend my money while he locked the door on my children. "Daddy, look!" Leo shouted, waving a jagged branch like a sword. I gave them a small, practiced wave, my face a mask of paternal warmth. Beneath the surface, however, the surgeon was already scrubbed in. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to call him and demand an apology that would only result in Gretchen playing the victim to our aging parents. No, a direct confrontation is messy. It creates scars that never quite heal correctly. I preferred a more controlled environment. I opened my laptop and began a new spreadsheet. I titled it Operational Expenses. I thought back to the dozens of small slights over the last 3 years. There was the time Gretchen forgot Maya's nut allergy at the summer barbecue. There was the time Desmond misplaced the heirloom watch our father intended for me, only for it to appear on his wrist during a gala 6 months later. I had always let it slide. I was the successful one, the one with the steady hands and the heavy bank account. I was supposed to be the bigger person, but being the bigger person is an exhausting role to play when the smaller people are busy picking your pockets and kicking your shins. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It had gone lukewarm. I didn't mind. I like things at a manageable temperature. My mind drifted to the Mountain Estate. Desmond loved that place. He loved the status it gave him to host the town's elite there. He loved the mahogany-paneled study and the way the snow looked against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He thought he owned the atmosphere of that house. He forgot that I owned the mortgage. I began to type. First, I needed to verify the current standing of the family trust. Desmond was the administrator, a title he'd lobbied for because he had more time for paperwork. But I was the primary contributor. It was a delicate architecture of finances, one that he assumed I was too busy to inspect. He saw me as a biological machine that produced currency, a man too focused on the operating theater to notice the drama in his own living room. He was about to learn that a surgeon's most important skill isn't knowing where to cut. It's knowing exactly how much pressure to apply before the whole system collapses. I heard the front door open. My wife, Sarah, walked in, her arms laden with groceries. She saw my face and paused, her keys jingling as she dropped them on the counter. She knew that look. It was the look I had when a procedure was going sideways and I was calculating the recovery time. "What did he do now?" she asked, her voice weary. "He sent an email," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "The kids aren't invited to the mountain for the holidays. It's for the sake of the atmosphere." Sarah's eyes hardened. She didn't argue. She didn't ask me to be the bigger person this time. She just looked out at the kids in the yard and then back at me. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give him exactly what he asked for," I replied. "A very quiet, very sophisticated holiday, just not the one he's expecting." I spent the next hour in my study, the door pulled shut. I began by contacting a friend from my university days, a man named Elias, who specialized in digital forensics and private security. Elias owed me a significant favor from a decade ago, a favor involving a very complex gallbladder and a very late night. "Dorian," Elias answered, his voice crackling with the ambient noise of a busy office. "I haven't heard from you since you saved my life. What's up?" "I need a comprehensive audit of a private account," I said, "and I need some eyes on a social media campaign, discreetly." "Who's the target?" "My brother," I said. I felt a strange, tingling sensation in my fingertips. It wasn't nerves, it was anticipation. I want to see everything he's been posting, everything he's been buying, and everyone he's been trying to impress. I want a map of his vanity. "Sounds personal," Elias noted. "It's professional," I corrected him. "I'm just performing a long overdue checkup." After I hung up, I sat in the dim light of the study. I could see the dusty spines of my medical texts on the shelves. Gray's Anatomy, Principles of Surgery. They were books about how to fix things, how to mend what was broken. But sometimes, to fix a life, you have to remove the rot. You have to identify the tissue that is causing the infection and excise it with a steady, unwavering hand. I began to draft a reply to Desmond's email. I kept it brief. I didn't mention the kids. I didn't mention the money. I didn't mention the game room. "Desmond," I wrote, "understood. The kids and I will make our own arrangements. I hope the atmosphere is everything you've dreamed of. See you soon." I hit send and watched the little progress bar slide across the screen. It felt like the first incision. Clean, precise. I spent the rest of the afternoon observing. I looked at Gretchen's public social media profile. She was already posting about the exclusive nature of the upcoming holiday, sharing photos of expensive crystal and hinting at a major announcement that would take place at the estate. She was building a pedestal for herself, one brick of vanity at a time. I noticed a photo of the mountain house, my house, tagged as the Wolf Sanctuary. In the background, I could see the vintage skis I'd bought our father before he passed. Desmond had claimed they were lost in the move. The sarcasm in my mind grew sharper. They were so predictable. They moved through life with the clumsy arrogance of people who thought they were the protagonists of a story they hadn't even written. They assumed I was a secondary character, a supporting actor whose only job was to provide the set and the props. I walked back into the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the sink. I watched it swirl away, disappearing into the dark. I had a plan. It wouldn't involve shouting matches or ruined dinners. It wouldn't involve anything that could be traced back to a loss of control. It would be a series of subtle shifts, a gradual reordering of their reality until they found themselves standing in a room with no floor. I would start with the game room. Desmond was so proud of that space. He spent hours there, preening in front of his friends, playing the part of the successful homeowner. I knew the security codes for his house. I'd helped him install the system when he was too paranoid to do it himself. I knew the layout of his Wi-Fi network. I knew the rhythms of his household. Tomorrow, while he was at his consulting job, which mostly consisted of long lunches paid for by a business account I subsidized, I would pay a visit. I wouldn't break anything. I wouldn't steal anything. That would be beneath me. I would simply introduce a little bit of chaos into his perfect environment. I would rearrange the furniture of his life just enough to make him feel like he was losing his mind. I looked out at the backyard again. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, thin shadows across the grass. Leo and Maya were coming inside, their faces flushed with the cold, their laughter ringing through the air. They were the only things in my world that were pure, the only things that weren't part of a calculation. Desmond and Gretchen had made a mistake. They thought they were excluding my children from a party. They didn't realize they were excluding themselves from my mercy. As I tucked the kids into bed that night, Maya looked up at me with her wide, trusting eyes. "Are we going to the snow house this year, Daddy?" I smoothed her hair back, my touch light and certain. "We're going somewhere much better, honey. Somewhere very special." "Will Uncle Desmond be there?" "No," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. "Uncle Desmond is going to be very, very busy." I walked out of her room and closed the door softly. The house was quiet, but my mind was a hive of activity. Act 1 was in motion. The betrayal had been documented, the target had been identified, and the first cut had been made. Now I just had to wait for the swelling to start. The downtown cafe was a cathedral of glass and polished chrome, the kind of place where the air always smelled of expensive roasted beans and the quiet hum of ambition. I sat in a corner booth, the city bustling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, while I waited for Elias. On the table before me was a simple manila folder. In an era of cloud storage and encrypted drives, there is still something profoundly tactile and satisfying about physical evidence. It feels more permanent, like a diagnosis written in ink rather than pixels. Elias arrived exactly 3 minutes late, a deliberate habit he maintained to prove he wasn't desperate for work. He slid into the seat opposite me, looking more like a tired university professor than a man who could dismantle a digital life with a few keystrokes. He didn't say hello, he simply tapped the folder. "Your brother is a creature of immense habit and even greater insecurity," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "He doesn't just use your money, Dorian. He performs with it. Every transaction he makes is a bid for attention from a specific group of people who don't actually like him." He opened the folder to reveal a series of financial snapshots. Desmond had been busy. The urgent repairs check I'd written him hadn't just gone toward the game room. It had been leveraged to secure a high-interest loan for a luxury SUV he didn't need. Gretchen, meanwhile, had been spending a small fortune on social consulting, essentially paying influencers to attend her parties so she could look relevant in the local social scene. "They're living in a house of cards," I remarked, tracing the line of a particularly egregious credit card statement. "And they've built it on my lawn." "It's more than that," Elias said, leaning in. Desmond's business partner, a man named Miller, thinks the capital for their new venture is coming from Desmond's personal inheritance. If Miller finds out that Desmond is actually just a glorified dependent on your payroll, the partnership dissolves. Their reputation is the only currency they have left. I nodded slowly. The internal monologue that usually guided me through a complex surgery began to map out the next phase of the operation. This wasn't just about a holiday exclusion anymore. It was about an anatomical correction of their reality. They had forgotten who provided the life support for their lifestyle. It was time to show them what happens when the power grid becomes unstable. After leaving Elias, I spent the afternoon in my private office at the hospital, though I wasn't looking at charts. I was looking at the family accountant's ledger. Arthur had been our family's financial gatekeeper for 30 years. He was a man of strict rules and a quiet, abiding loyalty to my father's memory. He also harbored a deep, unspoken irritation for Desmond's constant requests for advances on the family trust. "Arthur," I said when I reached him by phone, "I've been reviewing the allocations for the mountain estate. I'd like to move some things around, specifically the maintenance and staffing budget for the upcoming holiday season." "Dorian," Arthur's voice was cautious but intrigued, "the trust is set up to cover those expenses automatically. If you withdraw your personal contributions to the pool, the accounts will technically fall below the minimum threshold for the luxury concierge services Desmond has already booked." "I know," I said. "I'd like to reallocate those funds to a private travel account for my wife and children. We're planning a separate excursion. If the estate account triggers a deficit alert, don't worry about covering it from the reserve. Let the system send the notification to the administrator." "Desmond will receive a notice of insufficient funds in the middle of his preparations," Arthur noted. I could almost hear the faint rustle of a smile in his voice. "That could be inconvenient for him?" "Inconvenience is a wonderful teacher, Arthur." By the time I left the hospital, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in shades of bruised purple and orange. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to Desmond's neighborhood. It was a gated community, the kind of place where people paid a premium for the illusion of privacy while living in houses so close together they could hear their neighbors' regrets. I used my spare key, the one Desmond forgot I had, to enter through the side garage door. The house was empty. I knew from Gretchen's public calendar that they were at a gallery opening, likely trying to rub shoulders with people who found them exhausting. The house smelled of expensive candles and a faint, lingering scent of desperation. I walked straight to the basement. The game room was even more garish in person than it had been in the photos. The felt on the pool table was a deep, arrogant crimson. The arcade cabinets glowed with a neon hum. It was a temple to the money I had earned while Desmond was finding himself. I didn't break anything. I didn't spray paint the walls or tear the upholstery. That would be the work of an amateur, a person blinded by rage. I am a man of precision. I began with the pool table. I carefully adjusted the leveling bolts on one side, just enough so that a ball would subtly drift to the left over a long distance. It wouldn't be noticeable at first glance, but it would make a straight shot impossible. Then, I moved to the home theater system. I didn't cut the wires. I simply swapped the input labels on the universal remote and set the default volume to a staggering, ear-splitting level that would trigger only when the mute button was pressed. Finally, I turned my attention to the thermostat. I programmed a series of vacation overrides that would cause the heat to plummet to 60 degrees every hour on the hour, requiring a manual reset from a control panel hidden in the utility closet, a panel I knew Desmond didn't know how to operate. I stood in the center of the room, looking around. To the untrained eye, everything looked perfect. But I had introduced a dozen tiny glitches into the machinery of his joy. It was a psychological phantom limb. He would feel like something was wrong, but he wouldn't be able to find the wound. As I was leaving, I noticed a stack of mail on the kitchen island. On top was a glossy invitation to a winter gala hosted by the city's historical society. Desmond and Gretchen's names were highlighted. They were clearly planning to use the holiday at the mountain house as a springboard for their social ascent. I took a photo of the invitation and sent it to a contact I had in the local press, a gossip columnist who had once written a scathing piece about the hospital's board of directors until I'd provided her with a much better story about a rival's malpractice. "Hey, Chloe," I texted. "I hear the Wolf family gathering at the mountain estate is going to be the event of the season. Very exclusive. Very limited resources this year. You might want to look into their financial restructuring before you give them any more free publicity." The hook was set. The next morning, I took Leo and Maya to school. They were excited, chatting about the secret surprise I'd promised them. Their innocence was a sharp contrast to the web I was weaving, and it served as a constant reminder of why I was doing this. My children were not spatial constraints. They were the center of my world, and anyone who treated them as obstacles would soon find themselves navigating a very difficult path. I spent the middle of the day at a downtown cafe with my cousin Marcus. Marcus was the family's unofficial town crier. He was a man who lived for information, a social butterfly who fluttered from one branch of the family tree to the next, carrying seeds of rumor. "Dorian, you look remarkably relaxed for a man who's been kicked out of his own mountain house," Marcus said, leaning across the table with a conspiratorial grin. "I wasn't kicked out, Marcus. I was excused," I said, my tone light and teasing. "Desmond and Gretchen have a very specific vision for this year. I didn't want to clutter it with my excessive presence. In fact, I'm so supportive of their vision that I've decided to stay out of the way entirely. We've booked a private villa at the Alpine Peak Resort." Marcus's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Alpine Peak was the kind of place that made the family estate look like a roadside motel. It was where CEOs and celebrities went to disappear. "The Peak?" Marcus whispered, "but that costs a fortune. How did you get a reservation this late?" "I have a few grateful patients in high places," I lied smoothly. "It's going to be a quiet, luxurious Christmas for the kids. No stress, no spatial constraints. I just hope Desmond can handle the estate on his own. Without my usual oversight, the logistics can be a bit overwhelming." I knew that within 2 hours this information would reach Gretchen, and I knew that the knowledge of my luxury vacation would eat her alive. She wanted the sophisticated atmosphere, but I had just moved the goalposts to a stadium she couldn't afford to enter. By late afternoon, I was back in my office. My phone buzzed. It was an alert from the bank. The family estate's account had just attempted to process a 5-figure payment to a high-end catering firm. The payment had been declined. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Desmond. I let it ring. I watched the screen glow with his name, a digital pulse of panic. I waited until the very last second before I answered. "Dorian?" "Thank goodness." Desmond's voice was high-pitched, the sound of a man who had just realized the floor was vibrating. "Look, there's been some kind of glitch with the trust account. The caterers are calling me, and the concierge service says our reservation for the snow removal team is on hold. Can you call Arthur and straighten this out?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights. "I'm sorry, Desmond. I'm actually quite busy with some logistical issues of my own. I've had to reallocate my personal funds to cover the Alpine Peak trip. You remember? The one for the kids?" There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Alpine Peak?" he stammered. But the estate fees are due by Friday. If the payment doesn't go through, they'll cancel the staff. We'll be up there alone, Dorian, without the chef, without the housekeeping." "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity for some core family bonding," I said, my voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "A sophisticated, self-reliant atmosphere. Exactly what you wanted, right?" "Dorian, you can't be serious. I need that money." "I'm sure you'll find a way, Desmond. You're the administrator, after all. Use some of that inheritance you told Miller about, or maybe sell the pool table?" I hung up before he could respond. The internal monologue in my head was no longer a roar. It was a calm, steady rhythm. The first layer of the revenge was settling in. The social shame would follow, then the financial crumbling. And finally, the realization that they had traded their safety net for a few weeks of pretending to be better than me. I picked up a pen and checked off the first 3 items on my list. The operation was proceeding exactly as planned. The patient was awake, and they were finally starting to feel the sting. The Alpine Peak Resort was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, a sprawling fortress of cedar and local stone perched on a ridge that looked down upon the rest of the world. As we pulled into the heated driveway, the tires of my SUV crunching softly on the perfectly manicured slush, I felt a sense of profound equilibrium. My kids were in the back seat, their faces pressed against the glass as they marveled at the ice sculptures lining the entrance, frozen titans illuminated by soft violet LEDs. This was the stage I had set, and the performance was about to go viral. I had spent the drive up checking the digital pulse of my brother's household. Thanks to the breadcrumbs I had left for the local press and the technical difficulties I'd introduced to their home, the Wolf household was currently a theater of quiet desperation. My phone buzzed with a notification from the security system I still monitored. The thermostat in Desmond's game room had just triggered its 10th hourly reset. I could almost picture him down there in his designer parka, fuming as he tried to figure out why his temple of leisure had become a walk-in freezer. Once we checked into our suite, a sprawling multi-level sanctuary with a private outdoor hot tub and a fireplace that ignited with a whisper. I went to work. I wasn't just here to vacation, I was here to document. I had hired a professional videographer under the guise of capturing family memories, a young man named Julian who knew exactly how to frame a shot for maximum envy. "Make it look effortless, Julian," I instructed, adjusting my cashmere sweater. "I want the lighting to suggest that this isn't a special occasion, but rather our baseline for a Tuesday." We began a curated blitz of the family's social landscape. I started with a simple photo of Leo and Maya sitting at a hand-carved mahogany table, being served hot chocolate by a personal attendant. I captioned it, "Finding a little bit of space for the kids to breathe. Sometimes the right atmosphere makes all the difference." It was a direct surgical strike against Desmond's email about spatial constraints. The reaction was instantaneous. My phone began to vibrate with a rhythm that suggested a panicked heartbeat. First came the likes from our extended cousins, the ones who usually bowed to Gretchen's social dictates but were now clearly captivated by the sheer scale of our luxury. Then came the comments. Marcus was the first. "Incredible. Makes the old family estate look like a summer camp. Enjoy the view, Dorian." I knew exactly where Desmond and Gretchen were at that moment. They were at the family estate, likely shivering in the drafty main hall because the professional heating contractors had canceled due to the payment glitch I'd orchestrated. They would be checking their phones, seeing the opulence I was providing for the children they had deemed an inconvenience. "Daddy, look at the mountains," Maya shouted, pointing through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the jagged, snow-capped peaks painted gold by the setting sun. "They're beautiful, honey," I said, my voice smooth and resonant, "and they're all ours for the week." As the kids went to explore the resort's private arcade, a space that made Desmond's basement look like a dusty attic, I retreated to the balcony. I opened a separate app on my phone, one that monitored the family trust's internal notifications. A red banner blinked at me. Urgent. Insufficient funds for property taxes. Mountain estate. Desmond had been so busy trying to look rich that he had forgotten the most basic rule of wealth: the bills always come due. By diverting my quarterly contribution to pay for this resort stay, I had left him with a massive deficit. Usually, I would have covered it without a word, acting as the invisible safety net that kept the family name reputable. But the net had been retracted. My phone rang. It was Gretchen. This was a rare occurrence. She usually communicated through Desmond or via passive-aggressive group texts. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Dorian," she began, her voice tight, vibrating with a frequency that suggested she was holding back a scream. "What exactly is the meaning of your latest post? And why is Desmond saying the estate accounts are frozen?" "Gretchen, hello?" I said, leaning against the stone railing, watching a hawk circle the valley below. I'm not sure what you mean. My post is just a celebration of family. Isn't that what the holidays are about? Creating the right atmosphere?" "Don't play games with me," she hissed. "We have guests arriving in 2 days. The staff hasn't shown up because their deposits haven't cleared. Desmond is beside himself. You need to fix this immediately." "I'm afraid I can't help you there," I replied, my tone one of mild, clinical regret. "I've had to be very disciplined with my finances lately. Maintaining a sophisticated atmosphere at a place like Alpine Peak is quite an investment. I assumed Desmond, as the administrator, had everything under control. He was so confident in his email. "You're doing this on purpose," she whispered. "You're trying to humiliate us." "I'm simply following your lead, Gretchen. You wanted a holiday where everyone knew their place. My children and I found ours. It just happens to be several thousand feet higher than yours. If you'll excuse me, the concierge is here with our dinner menu. I hear the truffle risotto is life-changing. I ended the call before she could retort. The silence that followed was delicious. I could feel the tension of years of being the reliable brother slipping away, replaced by the cold, hard satisfaction of the strategist. That evening, I doubled down. I posted a video Julian had edited, a montage of the kids laughing as they decorated a 20-foot Christmas tree in our suite, interspersed with slow-motion shots of the resort's world-class amenities. I tagged every single member of our extended family, including Desmond's business partner, Miller. The commentary in my head was a sarcastic play-by-play. Watch this, Desmond. Watch the way the light catches the crystal while you're probably trying to figure out how to defrost a frozen turkey in a kitchen with no chef. By 10 o'clock, the social media fallout had reached a fever pitch. The cousins were now openly questioning why the core family gathering was happening in a drafty old house when the real party seemed to be happening at the peak. I saw a post from one of Gretchen's socialite friends, a woman who lived for status. Wait, is the wolf party at the estate still on? I'm hearing the staff walked out. Might have to check out the peak instead. It was a social contagion. I had introduced a virus of doubt into their reputation, and it was spreading with beautiful, predictable speed. I took a sip of a very old, very expensive scotch and looked at my laptop. Elias had sent an update. He had successfully gained access to the private messaging logs between Desmond and Miller. It was better than I'd hoped. Miller was already asking pointed questions about why the inheritance funds hadn't been moved into the venture's operating account yet. Desmond was lying, claiming there was a banking holiday delay. I sent a quick, anonymous tip to Miller's office email, attached with a public record of the estate's recent tax delinquency notice. Just a heads up from a concerned observer. You might want to verify the liquidity of your partner's assets before the new year. The pressure was mounting. In the medical world, we call this a systemic collapse. When one organ fails, the others have to work harder to compensate, eventually leading to a total shutdown of the organism. Desmond was the heart of the deception, and I was slowly cutting off his oxygen. A knock at the suite door interrupted my thoughts. It was the resort manager, a tall man with an impeccable suit and a gaze that missed nothing. "Dr. Slate," he said with a slight bow, "I hope your stay is proving satisfactory." "It's perfect, thank you." I should inform you that we've received several dozen inquiries this evening from individuals claiming to be your associates, asking if there are any additional suites available on your floor. It seems you've become quite the trendsetter. "Tell them we value our privacy," I said, smiling, "but feel free to tell them the view is incomparable." After he left, I stepped back out onto the balcony. Far below, in the distance, I could see the faint, flickering lights of the valley. Somewhere down there, in a house that was becoming a prison of his own making, my brother was realizing that the underdog had teeth. The physical revenge was the most satisfying part. It wasn't about violence. It was about the tangible loss of comfort. Desmond loved his luxuries. He loved the feeling of being pampered, of being the man in charge. By removing the financial lubrication that made his life run smoothly, I had turned his own home into an obstacle course. Every cold room, every declined credit card, every silent telephone from a friend who was now looking toward the peak was a physical blow to his ego. I pulled up the last video Julian had filmed. It was a shot of me, standing in front of the fireplace holding a glass of wine. I looked directly into the camera, a look of calm, terrifying serenity on my face. "To family," I said in the video, my voice barely a whisper, "and to getting exactly what you deserve." I didn't post that one yet. I was saving it for the climax. As I sat there, the cold mountain air crisp against my skin, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known in years. My internal monologue was no longer a list of grievances. It was a checklist of completed tasks. Act 2 was halfway through, and the escalation was reaching its peak. Desmond and Gretchen were no longer the ones in control of the narrative. They were merely characters in a story I was writing, and I was currently in the process of editing them out of the final draft. The best part was the anticipation. I knew that tomorrow Desmond would try to make a stand. He would try to salvage his reputation with some desperate, grand gesture. And I was already 2 steps ahead, waiting in the shadows with a pair of surgical shears, ready to snip the next cord. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the mountains. It was a sophisticated atmosphere, indeed. The transition from the serene heights of the Alpine Peak Resort back to the urban sprawl of the city felt like descending from a dream into a clinical trial. I had left Sarah and the kids under the watchful eye of the resort's elite security, claiming a sudden surgical emergency at the hospital required my presence. In truth, the surgery I was performing was ongoing, and the patient, my brother's carefully constructed social life, was currently on the table, failing to respond to resuscitation. I spent the first few hours of my return in a nondescript rental sedan parked 3 blocks away from Desmond's office. I didn't want him to recognize my car. I wanted to be the ghost in the machine. According to the tracking data Elias had provided from Desmond's phone, a minor intrusion justified by the family safety clause of the shared data plan I paid for, my brother was currently at his desk, likely staring at a screen full of red ink and unanswered messages. The physical sabotage I had initiated in the game room was just the beginning. The goal was to create a sense of environmental instability, a psychological erosion where the familiar became treacherous. I had already arranged for a maintenance crew to arrive at his home that morning. They weren't there to fix anything. They were actors from a local agency, hired to park a loud, idling truck in his driveway and mill about with clipboards, looking concerned and pointing at the foundation. To the neighbors, it looked like a major structural disaster. To Gretchen, it was a social catastrophe. My phone pinged. A message from our neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose hobby was monitoring the neighborhood's moral and aesthetic standards. "Dorian, dear, I see there's a massive crew at your brother's place. Something about the sewage lines? I do hope it's not contagious. We have our garden party tomorrow." I smiled. The rumor mill was churning at a professional grade. Around noon, Desmond emerged from his building. He looked frayed. His suit, usually pressed to a razor's edge, was wrinkled, and he kept touching his temple as if trying to massage away a persistent migraine. He climbed into his luxury SUV, the one I knew was 3 payments behind, and began to drive. I followed at a discreet distance, mirroring his movements with the practiced ease of a man who spent his life navigating the narrow corridors of human anatomy. He headed toward the city's upscale commercial district. He pulled into the valet lane of an Italian restaurant that served as the unofficial headquarters for the city's power brokers. This was where Miller, his partner, usually held court. I parked half a block away and watched through binoculars. Desmond was met at the door not by a welcoming host, but by Miller himself. The body language was unmistakable. Miller stood with his arms crossed, his stance wide and aggressive. Even from a distance, I could see the animated gestures of a man who felt he had been misled. Desmond was backpedaling, his hands raised in a placating gesture. It was a beautiful display of submission. As they spoke, I sent a signal to a local courier I had hired. Moments later, a bicycle messenger pulled up to the valet stand and handed Miller a heavy, official-looking envelope. Inside were the bank statements Elias had gathered, records of Desmond's personal debt, and the loans he had taken out against the business venture's future earnings. Miller opened the envelope right there on the sidewalk. I watched the realization dawn on him. He didn't shout. He simply turned around and walked back into the restaurant, leaving Desmond standing alone next to the valet stand, looking like a man who had just seen his reflection in a shattered mirror. The chase continued into the afternoon. Desmond, now visibly panicked, drove aimlessly through the city. He stopped at 3 different banks, likely trying to secure a short-term loan or find a sympathetic manager who would overlook the insufficient funds flags on his accounts. Each time, he emerged looking smaller, his shoulders hunching more with every rejection. I decided it was time for a more direct interaction, one that didn't involve words. I followed him to a high-end grocery store where Gretchen's sister, a woman whose vanity was only matched by her inability to keep a secret, was currently shopping. I knew she was there because she had been live-streaming her holiday prep on social media. Desmond walked into the store, probably looking for Gretchen or a bottle of something to dull the edge of the day. I followed him in, keeping my hat low and my sunglasses on. He didn't see me, but he did see his sister-in-law. She was standing in the wine aisle, surrounded by a small group of women from their social circle. I moved to the next aisle over and used a small, handheld remote, a device Elias had configured to interfere with older model smartphones. I triggered a localized signal jammer. Suddenly, the women's phones began to beep and vibrate with connection lost errors. In the ensuing confusion, I stepped around the corner and made sure I was visible to the sister-in-law for just a fraction of a second before disappearing behind a display of imported oils. "Dorian?" I heard her call out, her voice sharp with curiosity. "Is that you?" Desmond turned at the mention of my name, his eyes darting around the store like a cornered animal. But I was already gone, slipping through the back service entrance. The seeds were planted. Now, the sister-in-law would spend the next hour telling her friends that she'd seen a distressed Dorian lurking in the shadows, or perhaps that the brothers were having a clandestine meeting. The mystery would only add to the weight of Desmond's public humiliation. By late afternoon, the cat-and-mouse game moved back toward Desmond's neighborhood. I pulled over and waited near a park he had to pass to get home. As his SUV approached, I pulled out into the lane, forcing him to slow down. I didn't speed off. I stayed exactly 5 miles under the limit, making him follow me. I could see him in my rearview mirror, his face a mask of frustration. He honked. I tapped my brakes. He tried to pass. I subtly drifted to the center of the road. It was a petty, physical manifestation of the control I now held over his life. I was the obstacle he couldn't bypass. I was the slow, steady pressure that was forcing him to confront his own helplessness. Finally, he swerved into his driveway, nearly clipping the idling maintenance truck that was still parked there. He jumped out of the car, looking ready to scream at the workers, but they simply climbed into their cab and drove away as soon as he approached, leaving him standing in a cloud of exhaust. I drove past his house slowly, lowering my window just enough for him to see my eyes. I didn't wave, I didn't smile, I just looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. The look of pure, unadulterated fear on his face was a more potent reward than any of the money he had stolen. I went back to my own home, the quiet, empty apartment that felt like a sanctuary after the day's maneuvers. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the dark, my laptop glowing on the coffee table. Elias had sent a final update for the day. He had intercepted a series of frantic texts between Gretchen and her sister. The twist I had been waiting for finally emerged. Gretchen wasn't just a passive beneficiary of Desmond's schemes, she was the architect of the Christmas exclusion. The text revealed that she had convinced Desmond that my kids were distractions from the high-status guests she wanted to impress. She had even suggested that my absence would make it easier for them to renegotiate the family trust terms with our parents, as I wouldn't be there to provide a counter-narrative. If Dorian is at the peak, he's not here to whisper in Dad's ear, she had written. We need that house in our names before the new year. Just keep him distracted with the resort stuff. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of clarity. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just a snub, it was a coup. They were trying to cut me out of the family legacy entirely, using my own desire for a peaceful holiday for my children as a weapon against me. The internal monologue in my head shifted. The sarcasm was replaced by a singular, focused intent. This was no longer a matter of pride or hurt feelings. This was a defensive operation. I was protecting my children's future from a pair of predators who shared my last name. I picked up my phone and called Arthur, the accountant. "Arthur," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I want to move forward with the formal audit of the trust management, and I want to exercise the default clause on the property maintenance agreement for the Mountain Estate. If the administrator hasn't met the liquidity requirements by midnight, I want the deed transferred back to the primary guarantor. That's me." "Dorian, that will effectively evict them during the holiday," Arthur said, his voice hesitant. "The atmosphere they wanted was one of exclusivity, Arthur. I'm just making it official. They are now excluded." As I hung up, I looked at a photo of my kids on the mantel. They were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other in the snow at Alpine Peak. They had no idea of the war being fought on their behalf. They only knew they were safe and loved. I spent the rest of the night preparing for the final phase. I contacted a few of the influencers Gretchen had been trying to court, women who valued their own reputations above all else. I didn't have to say much. I simply shared a few choice documents from the audit, showing that the lavish lifestyle they were being invited to participate in was actually a sinking ship. By the time the sun began to rise, the digital and social walls were closing in on Desmond and Gretchen. The physical sabotage had destabilized their home, the social sabotage had destroyed their reputation, and the financial sabotage was about to take their shelter. The cat-and-mouse game was almost over. The mouse was trapped in a corner of its own making, and I was simply waiting for the clock to strike 12. The Mountain Estate, once the crown jewel of our family's perceived prosperity, looked haggard under the gray, oppressive sky of late December. The sweeping driveway had not been plowed, leaving deep, jagged ruts in the frozen slush, where Desmond's SUV had clearly struggled to gain traction. I pulled my vehicle to a stop at the edge of the property, the engine purring with a quiet, expensive confidence that felt like a rebuke to the surrounding decay. I was not here as a guest, nor was I here as a brother. I was here as the primary guarantor of a failing enterprise, arriving to inspect the collateral. Inside, the house was a cavern of chilled air and mounting tension. The grand foyer, which should have been smelling of pine and expensive catering, smelled instead of damp wood and the faint metallic tang of a hard-pressed furnace. Without the professional staff I had quietly defunded, the sophisticated atmosphere had curdled into a scene of domestic disarray. Empty boxes of store-bought appetizers sat on the antique sideboard, and a layer of dust had settled over the mahogany banisters like a fine shroud. Desmond and Gretchen were in the sunken living room, surrounded by a small, uncomfortable assembly of relatives. My parents were there, looking bewildered and frail in the center of the storm, alongside Marcus and Gretchen's sister. It was a family intervention, though not the kind Desmond had envisioned. He had called this meeting to plead for a collective injection of capital to save the holiday, unaware that the very people he was asking for help had already been briefed by me on his various financial indiscretions. I entered the room without a sound, standing in the shadows of the archway for a moment to observe. Desmond was pacing, his face a frantic mask of exhaustion. Gretchen was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her eyes darting toward her phone as if she expected a social media miracle to descend and rescue her reputation. "It's just a temporary liquidity issue," Desmond was saying, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation. "The bank had a technical error with the trust transfers. If everyone could just chip in for the property taxes and the staff retainers, we can get everything back on track by New Year's." "Desmond," Marcus said, his tone unusually grave, "I saw the audit notes. There was no technical error. The funds were reallocated because the account didn't meet the minimum balance. Where did the maintenance reserve go?" Desmond froze. He looked at Gretchen, who suddenly found the pattern on her silk scarf fascinating. It went into the venture capital project, for the family's future." "You mean the venture Miller just pulled out of?" I asked, stepping into the light. The room went silent. Desmond's head snapped toward me, his eyes widening with a mixture of terror and fury. He looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide and had just realized the mountain was still moving. "Dorian," he stammered, "what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at your resort." "The resort was lovely, Desmond. Very spacious," I said, walking slowly toward the center of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it low and clinical, the way I would explain a difficult prognosis to a patient who had ignored every warning sign. But I felt a responsibility to check on the estate. After all, as the primary guarantor, I wouldn't want the property to fall into a state of neglect. It affects the valuation. I moved past him and adjusted a painting on the wall that was hanging slightly crooked, a portrait of our grandfather that Desmond had never liked. The physical act of fixing it felt like a declaration of ownership. "You did this," Gretchen hissed, standing up. Her composure was gone, replaced by a jagged, raw hostility. "You manipulated the accounts. You've been stalking us, sabotaging our home, turning our friends against us. You're trying to destroy us just because we wanted one holiday without your kids underfoot." "I haven't manipulated anything, Gretchen," I replied, turning to face her. "I simply stopped subsidizing your delusions. I stopped being the invisible hand that paid for the chef you couldn't afford and the heat you didn't appreciate. If your lifestyle collapses the moment I stop holding it up, then it wasn't much of a lifestyle to begin with, was it?" I looked at my parents. My father was staring at Desmond with a look of profound disappointment, a weight more crushing than any financial debt. My mother was weeping silently into a handkerchief. "Dorian, please," my mother whispered. "It's Christmas. Can't we just find a way to make this right?" "I am making it right, Mother," I said gently. "I'm ensuring that the family's assets are no longer being drained by people who view us as an ATM. Desmond has been using the trust as a personal slush fund. He's been lying to his partners, lying to his parents, and attempting to secure the deed to this house through fraudulent restructuring. I have the digital logs to prove it." Desmond lunged at me then, a clumsy, uncoordinated movement born of pure panic. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped to the side and he stumbled into the heavy oak coffee table, knocking over a tray of lukewarm tea. He landed on his knees, gasping, looking small and broken against the backdrop of the luxury he had tried so hard to steal. "Don't touch me, Desmond," I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You don't have the hands for a fight, and you certainly don't have the stomach for the consequences." I walked over to the windows and pulled back the heavy drapes, letting the gray, unforgiving light flood the room. The luxury was gone. In this light, the house just looked old and cold. "Here is the penultimate reality of your situation," I continued. "As of midnight, the default clause on the property agreement was triggered. The estate is no longer under the administration of the Wolf Trust. It has reverted to my private holding. You are currently guests in my house, and I'm afraid your reservation has expired." "You're evicting us?" Gretchen shrieked. "In the middle of winter? Where are we supposed to go?" "You have that lovely game room back in the city," I reminded her with a thin, sharp smile. "Of course, it might be a bit chilly. I hear the thermostat has been acting up, and I'm sure your sister has a spare room, though she might be busy explaining to her social circle why she was seen at a grocery store with a man who can't pay his catering bills." The humiliation in the room was palpable. It was a physical weight, pressing down on them until they could barely breathe. Desmond stayed on the floor, his head in his hands, the image of a defeated king whose kingdom had been revealed to be made of cardboard. I turned to Marcus and the other relatives. "I've arranged for a car to take my parents back to their home. I've also settled the outstanding utility bills so the pipes won't freeze after everyone leaves. As for the rest of you, I suggest you find your own way back. The atmosphere here is no longer conducive to a celebration. As the relatives began to shuffle out, murmuring in hushed, shocked tones, I walked over to Desmond. I reached down and picked up a small, gold-plated ornament that had fallen from the tree, a trinket Gretchen had bought to show off. I turned it over in my hand before setting it back on the table. "You thought I was the underdog, Desmond," I said softly, so only he could hear. "You thought because I was quiet and focused, I wasn't paying attention. You thought my children were an inconvenience to your brand? But you forgot one thing. I'm a surgeon. I spend my life looking for the source of the problem and cutting it out. You were the problem. And now the procedure is almost finished." Gretchen tried to speak, but no words came out. She looked at her husband, then at me, and finally at the cold, empty house that no longer belonged to her. The realization of her total social and financial ruin was written in the lines of her face. "Get out," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, as final as a closing suture. They left within the hour. I watched from the upstairs balcony as they loaded their suitcases into the SUV, the vehicle sliding and spinning its wheels in the ruts of the driveway before finally catching grip and disappearing into the fog. They were headed back to a city that now knew their secrets, to a home that was cold and glitchy, and to a future that held no more of my money. I walked through the empty rooms of the estate. The silence was absolute. I went to the kitchen and found the circuit breaker. I flipped the switches for the non-essential zones, darkening the wings of the house that had been meant for the guests who never came. I sat in my father's old study, the one room that still felt like it belonged to the family I remembered. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah at the resort. "How are the kids?" I asked. "They're fine, Dorian. We just finished a late lunch. They're asking when you're coming back." "I'm on my way now," I said. "I just had to finish some paperwork. Everything is settled." "Is it over?" she asked softly. "Almost," I said, looking out at the darkening mountains. "There's just one more post to make." I hung up and opened the social media app one last time. I uploaded the video Julian had edited, the one of me by the fireplace, the one where I toasted to people getting exactly what they deserved. But I added a final caption, a simple sentence that would serve as the closing statement for the entire debacle. "The best thing about an exclusive atmosphere is knowing exactly who belongs in it. Happy holidays from our home to yours." I hit send and felt a profound sense of relief. The penultimate act was complete. The physical, social, and emotional landscape of their lives had been scorched. All that remained was the final peak, the moment where the last of their pretenses would vanish and they would have to face the cold, hard world they had built for themselves. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the house. I locked the front door and pocketed the key. As I drove down the mountain, the heater in my car humming a steady, reliable tune, I didn't look back. I was heading toward the peak, toward my children, and toward a future that was finally, truly my own. The drive back to the Alpine Peak Resort was a journey through a landscape of absolute clarity. The high-altitude air was thin and sharp, acting like a lens that focused my thoughts. On my dashboard, the smartphone screen flickered with a relentless cadence of notifications, a digital storm of my own making. My final post had not just landed, it had detonated. In the small, insular world of our city's social elite, where reputation is a fragile glass ornament, I had essentially swung a sledgehammer. I pulled into the resort's valley circle just as the evening stars began to pierce through the indigo veil of the twilight. The staff greeted me with the hushed reverence reserved for those who command both respect and resources. I walked through the lobby, my boots echoing on the polished stone, and felt a sense of finality. This was the peak. The view from here was unobstructed, and the air was finally clean. Upstairs, the suite was warm and filled with the gentle sounds of a family at peace. Leo and Maya were spread out on the rug, engaged in a complex board game, while Sarah sat by the fire, a book in her lap and a glass of wine on the side table. She looked up as I entered, her expression searching my face for the outcome. I simply gave her a small, definitive nod. The operation was a success. The malignant elements had been excised. I sat at the small writing desk overlooking the valley and opened my laptop for the final review. The viral fallout was more comprehensive than even I had anticipated. My video had been shared hundreds of times within the last 3 hours. Because I had tagged the key players in Desmond's professional circle, the narrative was no longer under his control. The comments section was a graveyard of his ambitions. Former associates were publicly distancing themselves, and the influencers Gretchen had worked so hard to impress were now making reaction videos, mocking the pretension of the Wolf family estate and praising the true elegance of my children's holiday. Elias sent one final encrypted message. It contained a link to a live feed of the local news' social page. A headline was already circulating. Local philanthropist and surgeon Dorian Slate reclaims family estate amidst financial scandal. The story didn't mention the betrayal or the kids. I had made sure of that. But it highlighted the administrative irregularities and the tax delinquencies. It was a public branding of incompetence that Desmond would never be able to scrub away. My internal monologue, which for weeks had been a sharp, jagged instrument of sarcasm and planning, suddenly went quiet. It was the silence of a completed task, the stillness that follows the final stitch in a successful surgery. I watched a video that Marcus had secretly recorded and sent to me, a short clip of Desmond and Gretchen arriving back at their suburban home. The maintenance trucks were gone, but the front lawn was a muddy ruin, and the house was dark. Desmond was seen struggling with the front door lock, the one I had remotely jammed through the security app, while Gretchen stood under the flickering porch light, looking utterly defeated. The physical revenge was complete. They were back in their cold, dysfunctional temple, stripped of the financial oxygen they needed to survive. The social revenge was absolute. They were pariahs in the very circles they had tried to dominate. And the emotional revenge, the knowledge that they had tried to discard my children only to find themselves discarded by the entire family, was a weight they would carry into every future holiday. A new notification appeared. It was a private message from Desmond. I expected a tirade, a scream into the digital void. Instead, it was a single sentence. "Please, Dorian, just tell me how to turn the heat back on." I looked at the message for a long time. I thought about the email he had sent me weeks ago, the one that clinically dismissed my children's presence. I thought about Gretchen's plan to steal the family legacy. I thought about the years I had spent as their bank account while they treated me as an afterthought. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence was the most honest answer I could provide. I simply logged out of the app and deleted the security credentials from my phone. He was the administrator. He could figure it out, just as he had promised he could handle the estate. "Daddy, come play," Maya called out, pulling me away from the screen. I walked over to the rug and sat down between my children. For the next hour, there were no spreadsheets, no audits, and no tactical maneuvers. There was only the sound of dice hitting the board and the joyful arguments of siblings. I looked at their faces, vibrant, happy, and entirely untouched by the ugliness of the last few weeks. I had built a wall around them, and inside that wall, the atmosphere was exactly what it should be. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the fire had burned down to a soft, glowing ember, Sarah and I stood on the balcony. The mountain air was freezing, but I didn't feel the chill. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," I said, "we enjoy the rest of our vacation. And when we go home, we do so with the knowledge that our house is finally in order. The estate is back in our name. I'll turn it into a foundation for pediatric care, a place where children are always the priority." "And Desmond?" "Desmond has the life he earned," I replied. "He wanted a core family experience. He has it. Just him and Gretchen, in a house they can't afford, with a reputation they can't repair. I imagine it's quite sophisticated." I felt a sense of closure that was almost physical. The revenge hadn't been about malice. It had been about restoration. It was a rebalancing of the scales, a correction of a systemic error. I had used my skills, my precision, my patience, and my ability to see the underlying structures of a situation to protect what mattered most. I looked out at the lights of the valley below. Somewhere down there, my brother was realizing that the world he had tried to build on a foundation of lies had finally succumbed to the gravity of the truth. He was realizing that I wasn't just the man who wrote the checks, I was the man who understood how the heart of the family actually beat. The story didn't need an epilogue. There was no need to see their eventual bankruptcy or the inevitable dissolution of their marriage. Those were just the lingering echoes of a bell that had already been rung. The peak had been reached, the view had been appreciated, and now it was time to descend back into a life that was quiet, honest, and full. As I turned to go back inside, I caught my reflection in the glass of the balcony door. I looked the same steady eyes, the same calm hands. But there was a lightness in my posture that hadn't been there before. The burden of being the silent provider, the overlooked brother, had been lifted. I was no longer the underdog. I was the architect. The internal monologue gave one final, satisfied hum. "Atmosphere," it whispered. "Everything is about the atmosphere." I stepped into the warmth of the suite and closed the door, locking the cold out for good. The holiday was just beginning, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the cost. I knew exactly what everything was worth. The saga of the Wolf family betrayal had ended not with a scream, but with the quiet click of a key turning in a lock. I had taken back the mountain, I had protected the children, and I had ensured that the only things that would remain from this Christmas were the memories we chose to keep. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the snow begin to fall outside, thick and heavy, covering the ruts and the scars of the world in a blanket of perfect silent white. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen.